Hey, everybody. So how many women do you think fought in our most recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? Numbers? 12, somebody said? No. 100? Try like 400,000. Okay? How many of you can name one woman who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan? I see one hand. Maybe two or three. Lights are bright. It's surprising to me how few people know the stories of women who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. Maybe people remember Jessica Lynch. That's the only one that anyone ever registers. Now, let me give you a few names of male soldiers. Chris Kyle. Know that guy? He wrote the book American Sniper that was made into a movie by Clint Eastwood. What about Marcus Luttrell, who wrote the book Lone Survivor that was also made into a hugely successful movie? Or Bo Bergdahl, who was featured in Serial, the Serial podcast recently. Or say a guy named Eric Greitens, who's our governor. Jason Kander, who ran against him. David Petraeus. I could go on and on. I mean, you guys know these guys, right? But why do you know them and not the women who fought in Iraq? One reason is that we have a certain myth for what a soldier is supposed to be. That's in part created by Hollywood. That is, and I define that myth as being white, male, stoic, and heroic. That certainly fits Chris Kyle. Here's another sort of definition of that myth that comes from a Missouri-born writer, Rick Atkinson. Rick Atkinson wrote, "I had long believed that the extravagant stress of combat is a great revealer of character, disclosing a man's elemental traits in the way a prism refracts light to reveal the inner spectrum." It's from a book called In the Company of Soldiers that was mostly about David Petraeus. There's some interesting things about this quote. First of all, I was a reporter in Iraq, and it was my experience that combat was not a great revealer of character. It was a destroyer of character. It did not reveal your inner prism. It was a thing that you wanted to avoid if you possibly could. Secondly, it's a man's elemental traits. One of the reasons that you don't hear stories about women from Hollywood is because they don't fit into this myth. They don't come to join the military because they want to become a man, in a certain sense. But also because if Hollywood were to tell the stories of women who were in the military, they would also have to tell the story of how men, like Chris Kyle, treat women who were in the military, particularly during the 2003 to 2015, let's say. And I'm going to tell you some stories about that based on the women who I interviewed for my novel, The Good Lieutenant, which has a lead female character. Jen McDonough I met in Iraq in 2006. Jen was a captain of a support company. Her job was to go outside the wire and retrieve vehicles that had been hit by IEDs or had driven into a canal or gotten broken, right? But going outside the wire, I mean outside this enclosure of these very large bases that we had into the Iraqi countryside, which was, in 2006, very dangerous. There were IEDs all over the roads. These could go off whenever you drove by. The battalion that I was embedded with lost 20 soldiers over a period of 4 months. So Jen would go out driving this thing called a Hercules, which is a vehicle that I think is really cool. And it's the size of a tank, and it could tow an M1 tank back to base. She told me a story one time about going out to a muddy field. It does rain in Iraq. It's not just desert. And trying to retrieve a thing called a Buffalo. It's a big vehicle like a phone truck. And she hooked up the cable that you can see and to the back axle of the Buffalo, started towing, the axle came off. Then her Hercules got stuck in the mud of this field. She called in another Hercules, tried to tow it out again. That Hercules got stuck. She called in a quick reaction force of the infantry guys, the really tough guys. They came in. They were going to rescue her. They got stuck. Her soldiers were patrolling the area. 2 of them stepped on a 500-pound bomb. They were blown straight up in the air, miraculously survived. She medevaced them out. One of her Humvees was hit by an IED, flipped over, badly injured the gunner who was standing on top of it. He had to be medevaced out. She called in a floating bridge. There was like this muddy field, then the canal, then a paved road, and he had to get all the vehicles over to the paved road, so they needed a bridge. She called in a bridge. The guy who brought the bridge drove into the canal. They had to get another bridge. It was a 5-day mission, okay? She was under fire for most of it. It turned out this field was heavily mined. She got all of these things out of this field, didn't lose a single soldier. After telling me this story, which takes her like an hour to tell, so we didn't have time for the whole thing, she said to me, the hardest thing about being in Iraq is that I don't have anyone to talk to. What did she mean by that? What she meant was there were no women in her battalion, which was an infantry battalion. She'd been attached to it. There were no women in a equal or higher authority position to her. She couldn't talk to people, express doubt or concern or fear that she could do the right thing to anyone below her, and she had no one above her that she could talk to. And the reason she didn't feel like she could talk to the male officers was that she felt like she went in and expressed doubt or fear or concern or wanted reassurance in any way. They would just say, oh, that's just a woman. Woman can't do this job. They'd see her as a category, not a person. Another example would be Angela Fiddle, who, there's the inside of the Hercules, by the way, which is also very cool. Angela Fiddle, who was a graduate of UMKC, and she was a former sergeant in Iraq. And here's how she describes her greeting when she went to Fort Hood for the first time.
At Fort Hood, there was a saying that I used to hear a lot. There's only 3 kinds of women in the Army. Bitches, sluts, and lesbians. I've been asked which one I was.
That's not an easy thing to have happen to you when you walk into your workplace environment. Another example of this would be Stacy Moore, who was a major when I met her, but she was a lieutenant in Iraq who ran convoys. She had a platoon sergeant who wouldn't carry out her orders. A platoon sergeant is a very important person. For a lieutenant, he's the person who's the conduit between the lieutenant and the enlisted soldiers in that platoon. Platoon sergeant has to carry out the lieutenant's orders, but he didn't, and he also would sort of follow her around, looming over her in the office, like a certain presidential candidate did during the debates with a female candidate a while back. She couldn't get him to stop this, so what she did was wrestle him, pin him, get his head between her knees and start pulling on his ears until he said that he would do what she said or what she wanted. That is not a normal workplace environment, okay? So, and it doesn't fit into the Hollywood narrative myth of the stoic, heroic male soldier, right? That is why we don't see these movies. But it also means that there are things that we can learn from women in the military. They have a special place and a special role. They are outsiders to that structure. And because they're outsiders to that male-dominated structure, they have to learn about it better than the men, right? They have to learn how to fit in. They have to learn all the rules, all the regulations. And they also know, unlike male soldiers, that, or not necessarily, but most male soldiers, that the structure can be wrong because it treats them wrong, right? And that gives them a better chance to teach their soldiers how to do right. It also gives them empathy for other people who are outsiders to that structure, most specifically Iraqis. Okay? Now, how does this apply to civilian life? Well, there was a study done by the Women's Foundation based in Kansas City with a couple professors from KU, and they studied over 100 Special Forces troops, men and women, talking to them about what it was like to integrate women into a male-dominated organizational structure like that. Their findings were very similar to my own. I mean, there was one woman who said, my first deployment was terrible. I was treated like an inhuman. I'd be sitting there, eating dinner with my food right in front of me, and somebody would knock it to the ground and say, pick it up, bitch. If you're the only woman in that environment, there's That's a difficult situation to deal with, that kind of overt aggression. I give these examples because I don't think you understand how overt that aggression was. The study had several interesting conclusions. One was that women, when they got Army training, could do all the jobs that they needed to do, and the training gave them confidence, right? I can do this. I know I can do this. I know I can run the Hercules. I know I can go out on missions and retrieve broken vehicles from outside the wire. They also discovered, however, that confidence in and of itself and training was not enough to overcome structural obstacles that your organization put in your way. What are examples of those structural obstacles? Well, for instance, one of the ways you get promoted in the Army is to have combat service, okay? When I spoke to Jen McDonough in 2006, what she was doing was not defined as combat. Every job that every woman had in the Army at that time, even though many were killed and injured, was not defined as combat. Combat roles were only infantry and combat engineers. Support troops didn't have, quote, combat roles. But that's only a definition, right? Because support troops, given the story I just told you, were engaged in combat. Okay? That's a structural impediment to advancement. Labels. My talk is an example of this problem. What can we learn from female soldiers, right? One of the study participants said, it's always female something. It's never the medic or the civilian affairs officer. It's always the female medic or the female civilian affairs officer. How many times do we in our daily lives in America right now in civilian society do the same thing? How many times do we say, hey, look at that female cop or that female surgeon or female newscaster or female presidential candidate, right? By putting that modifier there, we emphasize the fact that the structure that that person is a part of is gendered away from them, right? It's for a different gender than them. Also, those kinds of stereotypes lead to differences in the way that jobs get assigned. For instance, Angela Fiddle was trained to do all kinds of stuff that was typically male job oriented, like mechanical stuff, unloading heavy stuff, whatever. Whenever she would volunteer for a job that was male, that would be given instead, she would be passed over and be given to a guy who would be thought to be able to do a better job. Even if she was trained for the job, even if she was better than the guy they gave it to, or even higher ranking. That kind of stereotyping exists all the time in the Army, and it exists in civilian life as well, right? And the final thing that's important to remember is that the study found was that the women like Jen McDonough, Stacy Moore, whose picture you can see, and Angela Fiddle, instead of blaming or understanding that their work problems came from structural issues with the organization they were in, they tended to internalize that and say, it's my fault, I didn't work hard enough, I wasn't good enough, I didn't try hard enough, right? What we need to do is turn our gaze from the individual who's being disadvantaged by the structure that they're in to the structure itself. Okay? How do we do that? I would say we do it through narrative. I'm biased because I'm a person who makes narratives. But almost all of the women that I spoke with, not almost all of the women that I spoke with who were in the military when I was interviewing people for the Good Lieutenant said, we want stories about us. Why doesn't anybody make a movie about us? Why doesn't anybody write books about us? How come nobody knows about us? We have this very special story that we want people to know about. The reason that they want that story out there in part is they want to be represented like anybody else does, but because the larger public, when they experience those narratives, have empathy for the kinds of problems that I'm talking about, right? And this kind of empathy is universal. The individual who's in a structure that disadvantages them isn't just something that happens in the military. It happens all across our country and the world, right? And those narratives teach us how to escape that. And secondly, the study suggested that women who are in an organization like that need to talk to each other, right? So when they conducted these interviews, a female soldier would say, hey, this happened to me. Another one would say, oh, that happened to me too. And a third would say, yeah, I had that happen, right? And then they would realize, oh, it wasn't their fault, this problem. It was a problem that was common and part of their structure. Okay? The good news is that these women who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2003 and on have changed the military. And if they can change the military, then any organization can be changed, okay? Women are allowed in combat roles now, as of December 2015. That's because of the way these women performed and fought in the field during the years before that. Jen McDonough is now a lieutenant colonel. That means she's a battalion commander. That means that she will be there for some young female lieutenant to talk to in the future. Stacy Moore rose to the rank of major and is now at the Rand Corporation. Angela Fiddle got her degree from UMKC, got a law degree from KU, and is now a practicing lawyer. These women are going to change the way that we think about the military, and they're also going to be leaders in the military, in business, and in politics in the future. And because of their experience as outsiders inside a structure, they're going to have more empathy for people who are in that same position. Another good example would be Tammy Duckworth, who lost both of her legs in a helicopter crash in Iraq and is now, just recently was elected to the Senate in Illinois. You should look her up. I hope that you will take time to learn about the experiences of these women. You'll seek out their narratives. Maybe you'll even call Hollywood and ask them to make a movie about them one of these days. If this video works, I am now going to let you hear from Stacy Moore and give her the last word.
It's not necessary for us to be able to interact with females and female civilians. I think it's important for us to show cultures who are perhaps less accepting of women in leadership roles or accepting of women participating in civil society, to show them that women are able to do these things. It's a way for us to kind of exercise some soft diplomatic power and show the people that we're working with that our nation is strong because we use all of the talents of all of our people.
Thank you very much.